Good evening, good morning if you're in America. Welcome to the Bloor presentation on compliance and making it real for people in the trenches. My name is Andy Morris and I'm honored and privileged today to be hosting Nigel Stanley from Bloor Research. Before we get into the presentation, I thought I'd just take 2 slides and 30 seconds of your time just to let you know who LogLogic is and why we're so pleased to be working with Bloor. Nigel, if you're there, could you please advance the slide? Thank you. So LogLogic is a California company that does log management. We are in the SIEM space. We provide eventing and correlation for basic troubleshooting and operational research. We've been doing this since 2002, and we're reasonably successful in our space. In fact, when it comes to global enterprise class companies, we're the #1 independent provider. We provide more technology to larger companies for log management and IT data management than anybody else. And we're very, very pleased that Bloor have recognized some of our talent and have placed us in the center of the bullseye that they produced in the middle of last year. Next slide, please, Nigel. Now, the reason that that we're in business and the reason that we're working with Nigel today is that we recognize that IT has some basic problems, which are that systems are very sophisticated, they're very complex, and that they're very, very interconnected. And that complexity causes IT to have too little control and too little visibility. It means that it's very hard for IT to change systems, to add new users, to restructure, to buy new firewalls, to change vendors of software, because everything is too connected. What we try and do is we add that control and visibility to your systems. That additional control and visibility often manifests itself as additional security, which of course is always a good thing. And the reasons for doing that, if you could advance the next slide, please, Nigel. The reasons for trying to add the control and visibility are threefold. They are that people require better IT operations. You need to make sure that the backplane that you're providing your businesses is working efficiently. Of course, it needs to be secure, and so we sell security-based products. But more than anything else, it has to be compliant with legislation. Now, compliance to us is not an end goal. It's something you achieve on the way to better security and better operations. But the vast majority of our customer engagement are driven by budgets from the compliance part of the organizations. Now, regardless of the reason that you dialed in today to listen to Nigel, whether it was compliance, security, or IT operations in your background, you'll find that you all have something in common. And that is when you strip away the layers of what you're trying to do, everybody's actually asking for the same 3 things when it comes to those general business directives. And they want alerts. When things go wrong, businesses require a big flashing red light that says something has gone wrong. Following that, you obviously need the searching and discovery to find out, well, if something tripped an alarm, why did that happen, and what else occurred in the vicinity that we may have missed. And of course, once you've got all that information, you need to document it and prove the evidence so that you can stand up in court or in front of your industrial panel and say that you are still compliant, or the mistakes were made and they have been rectified. That is what LogLogic does. We provide alerting, searching, and reporting for IT operations, for security, and for compliance. Now, to put all of that in a business framework that makes much more sense to you, I am very pleased and honored today to introduce you to Nigel Stanley. Nigel is one of the premier researchers at Bloor. Bloor have recently published many white papers on compliance for the European Union and for the American market, and Nigel is going to take us through that. Nigel, over to you, sir.
Okay, Andy, well, thank you very much, and welcome to all of our attendees and listeners. So during the next half an hour, 45 minutes, what I hope to do is to try and make the world of compliance very real for us people out there in the trenches. We hear a lot about compliance, but what does it mean in reality? I think most people would agree that until fairly recently, information security people were very much buried away in server rooms and configuring firewalls, patching servers. But with the sudden surge of compliance and regulatory requirements being put onto businesses, IT security people are really required to understand and to help implement these compliance solutions. But how can security teams help join the dots between their security work and compliance issues? how can compliance requirements be met without placing undue strain on the organisation, causing what we call paralysis by analysis? And how can information security people add real value to the business following a compliance agenda? The pressure to deliver a secure IT infrastructure against the background of constantly changing compliance and regulatory demands is tough. It's a tough job to do. And this isn't helped by a reduction in the budgets that we've seen to achieve this ever-changing goal. The first part of this process is to get an understanding of exactly what compliance requirements you need to be worried about, and more importantly, those that can be put into the background. Not only do we need to consider state laws and federal laws and international laws, there are industry-specific regulations that further complicate the overall picture. But certainly organisations trading across international boundaries face a huge challenge as they try to get to grips with different legal structures and cultural demands. So hopefully during this webinar you get a chance to learn about the realities of achieving this acceptable level of compliance for your organisation, and hopefully give you some help for your own work down in the trenches. I'd imagine that everyone knows only too well the demands on us as information security professionals. I think it could possibly be argued that we've got one of the most difficult jobs in the IT business, as we need to be seen to add value whilst at the same time saying no, which is often a contradictory position. As the current financial situation rolls on, we're faced with doing more with less, and organisations that are increasingly worried about reputational risk more than ever before, as any damage to the business will have an effect on often slim profits. This work needs to be balanced with what I see as a relentless slog of dealing with malware and unexpected gotchas waiting in the wings to pounce on us. Some of us are pretty lucky to enjoy the support of the executive team where we work, but unfortunately other boards might see the information security role as nothing but a pain and something they wish it could certainly make go away. If this is your position, you certainly have my sympathies. Data security is now getting a lot of attention, and it is very much a subject of legal and regulatory compliance requirements. Failing to adhere to appropriate laws and regulations can result in legal actions, fines, reputational risk, and actually maybe, in extreme circumstances, imprisonment. Achieving this compliance in the broadest sense of the world is actually quite a good thing, as it often instills good practices and procedures. But certainly my experience is that on the other hand, over-compliance can be detrimental, as the business can be bogged down in achieving a goal that delivers little direct business benefit, or is seen to deliver little direct business benefit. And certainly many medium-sized organisations and businesses are very much struggling with compliance requirements, as they are big enough to be caught by the various requirements, but too small to have the resources to cope. Of course, failing a compliance audit can result in lots of difficult questions from the board of directors and from shareholders and partners and so on. The only thing we can promise is that there will be more compliance and regulatory requirements coming down the line to affect the way that we manage, handle data and ensure its security. The demands of a business culture that is becoming more and more compliance-oriented can be pretty significant. The problem is that this changing culture does lead to some pretty strange ideas. One objection to additional security spend I often hear from businesses is that they're fully compliant, and it's been proven by external auditors that they are fully compliant, and therefore they don't need to have in place much or any more investment in their information security systems. Some business managers, it makes me laugh, are actually quite astonished when they realize that their security has been breached, especially when they just spent considerable sums on establishing this compliant business environment. Indeed, the fact that the business is compliant, whatever we mean by that, has often, in some situations, induced a level of complacency in some as regards information security. IT security managers have got a real need to help educate business managers in the differences between compliance and security. That way, at least the business can make investment decisions based on accurate information rather than just assumptions. Achieving compliance in the broadest sense of the word can be a good thing, as it often, as we said before, instills good practices and procedures, but very much do too much and you cause problems. I do certainly feel for medium-sized businesses that are captured by this requirement to do compliance, and they have to spend a lot of time and effort in dealing with compliance issues, whilst at the same time having to run their day-to-day business, which is difficult enough, as we know. So what about the real cost of poor compliance and bad information security? Back in March of this year, Zurich Insurance announced that it was going to improve its information security after losing personal financial information on over 46,000 British clients through careless handling of unencrypted backup tapes. The backup tape, which also contained personal details of over 1,800 third-party insurance claimants from the UK, was lost by Zurich's South African sister company during what was described as a routine transfer of data to a data storage facility in South Africa back in August 2008. In total, over 51,000 British records were on the tape, along with a much larger number of details about other Zurich customers across South Africa and other areas of Africa. Interestingly, Zurich's UK arm wasn't informed about the loss of the data until a year later. In the end, Zurich was actually fined the equivalent of $5 million by the Financial Services Authority. And in fact, this is the highest fine that's been levied in the UK on a single firm for data security failings. And this is a great example of what we have in place with people that are failing to be compliant. Something goes wrong, and then they end up becoming prosecuted by an appropriate authority, and then a fine, which is a real tangible fine, affects the organisation. In many respects, the United States has very much led when it comes to data security laws that mandate stricter requirements and harsher penalties if data is compromised. The implementation of state-level data breach notification laws in California in 2002 was seen and is seen by many as a prime example of addressing individuals' concerns about their data privacy. And in this case, if personally identifiable data has been lost, then those individuals possibly affected must be notified and steps taken to help them manage any ongoing consequences. And as many of you know, a lot more of the other states have followed by putting in place similar legislation. Interestingly, if data has been demonstrably encrypted, then obviously there is no obligation to disclose its loss, because at the end of the day it's just ciphertext that's gone missing, none of the underlying data or plain text. What we're starting to see since 2002 is there's many US states introducing even more draconian laws. I think the state of Massachusetts has introduced some interesting legislation around protection of personal data and the actual requirement to encrypt that data as well. And some pretty significant penalties, fines up to $5,000 per infringement and so on. And we're starting to see other US laws encompassing data security and implying that you need to protect your data as well. We also then have the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act that very much gives powers to the Department of Health and Human Services to watch over and enforce rules applicable to the safe and secure handling of patient data, including personal identifiable data as well. And in fact, there are various safeguards in place to ensure that happens. We then have the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. That was all designed, as we know, to improve the regulation and accountability of publicly owned companies. And under Section 404, which is covering the management assessment of internal controls, there's a need to prove the integrity and confidentiality of financial information, which very much falls firmly back into the world of information security. And then finally, we've got the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, or GLBA, which is part of the Financial Services Modernisation Act. And again, in there, we've got situations where we need to protect data. Safeguarding of customer information is critical to that. So very much we've seen the United States leading when it comes to putting in place compliance. The EU, the European Union's got a very different makeup to the United States. The European Union, in contrast, currently comprises 27 member states and was established following the Maastricht Treaty back in 1993, that renewed the union that we originally called the European Economic Community, or the EEC. Just to give you an idea of the size, so the EU generates approximately 30% of worldwide GDP, and it's got around 500 million citizens, so it's a pretty large entity. The EU's developed a system of laws that apply to the movement of goods and people and the creation of a single trading entity. And each member state is subject to both EU and their own locally created national laws. There are countries that are geographically within Europe but don't have membership of the EU, for example Switzerland, and these countries are therefore not subject to EU-based laws. As part of its remit, the EU has created business-related compliance and regulatory requirements, as you would expect, and this includes laws that cover the safekeeping and management of data in computer systems. Failure to comply with these laws can result in criminal proceedings and prosecutions, so that any organisation operating in the EU needs to take such laws as seriously as those developed by individual nation states. When actually considering EU law, it's quite important and quite useful to have an understanding of the structure of the way the EU and works in terms of laws and how the laws are enacted. The EU Council represents national governments and is a council of ministers, and they have a 6-month rotating presidency. National ministers, so each of the member countries, their ministers attend meetings as appropriate to their various portfolios, and the European Parliament is elected every 5 years by citizens of the member states. Members of the European Parliament, or MEPs as we call them, have got geographically based constituencies, but they're generally larger than they would be for members of Parliament for the national Parliament. The European Commission acts as a civil service, and they are actually responsible for drafting new laws, which are then passed to this Parliament, the European Parliament, for discussion and enactment. The EU is based on rule of law, and that's laid down by a series of treaties and directives, which you'll see when we start to cover some of the individual requirements. These then become a collective, what we call legislative act of the EU, which are then enacted by member states. And if a member state fails to enact a particular requirement, then they can basically be taken to the European Courts of Justice and then have fines levied against them. So there is a requirement for member states to implement appropriate rules and regulations as and when they come down the line. So the compliance and regulatory framework in EMEA is really never far from the spotlight as it is in the US, and certainly in the current worldwide financial situation, it's forcing regulators to very much review their oversight and regulatory activities in an attempt to try and prevent such a crisis happening again. Of course, this is against the backdrop of a large number of data loss incidents that we're seeing across both the private and public sector. So if you're working as an information security professional, what EU requirements do you need to be thinking about? Well, here's an example of some of the things you need to be thinking about. These may or may not apply to you, depending on national or EU requirements, and of course the nature of your business and the type of data that you're processing. And believe me, these aren't a complete list. The 3 dots at the end indicate that they go on forever. So the list is huge, and I would suggest that you need to check locally on what affects you. But you can understand that there are a lot of requirements on people that are undertaking business across here in the EU. But then, that said, it's important that we don't forget a whole bunch of other legislation. You know, we've mentioned before the requirements from the US, and you know, these requirements are still applicable on EU companies that trade in or with US-based businesses. So you could quite well be affected by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act if you are working with US-based organisations. And again, this list isn't comprehensive. It's just an idea of what we mean by some of the legislations that might be applicable to you. It's very difficult to pick highlights out of any compliance and regulation field, but I think that two areas that certainly people I work with are very concerned about is the UK Data Protection Act. And I use the UK Data Protection Act as it's quite a useful example or a benchmark of a typical data privacy law within Europe. And then we have the PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which is just another example of a requirement that is basically put in place by a non-state organisation, but is applicable for organisations that are processing appropriate payments. So the UK Data Protection Act, and do read into this similar legislation right across the EU, but in the case of the UK Data Protection Act, this imposes legal obligations on anyone processing personal data, and they need to make sure that there is good practice and management of this data. In Part 1 of the Act, there are 8 what they call enforceable principles of good personal information handling. And these basically say that the data must be accurate and up to date. It's got to be fairly and lawfully processed. It's got to be secured. It can't leave the UK unless the destination countries have got similar legislation, which has got interesting implications for cloud-based applications, because how do we know where those servers are going to be based? The data has got to be processed in line with a person's rights. It must only be kept as long as necessary, so no unnecessary aggregation of data, keeping of data. The data has got to be processed for limited purposes, and it's got to be adequate, relevant, and not excessive. We then have Part 2 of the Act, and this gives individuals rights to find out what personal information is held about them on computers, and in fact in most paper records as well. The UK Information Commissioner's Office, or the ICO, has got legal powers to ensure that organisations comply with the requirements of the Data Protection Act. So a data controller who persistently breaks or breaches the Act can be served with what's called an enforcement notice, and they can be prosecuted for failing to comply with this enforcement notice. From April this year, the ICO's finally grown more teeth, and in the UK, the ICO can impose penalties not to exceed £500,000 for serious breaches of this Act. Now, we are still waiting for this big one to hit, as it were, but I understand there are some ongoing investigations that may result in this maximum fine actually hitting relatively soon. Certainly, if the loss of the 25 million records, as happened a couple of years ago by the UK's Revenue and Customs organisation, if that happened today, then the ICO has publicly stated that it would have levied the maximum fine against HMRC. But then, of course, you have another discussion about public money travelling from one place to another, but I guess that's beyond the scope of this presentation. So another example of a similar data protection law is one that's actually in Germany. So in Germany, they've implemented, as have the UK, the EU Directive 9546 EC, and this covers the protection of data held by organisations, and again, very much in a similar way as the UK. The Act, which is shortened to the BDSG, has got 7 basic principles, and it basically relates to the protection of data relating to individuals or data that allows an individual to be identified. The 16 Länder, which are basically areas or separate administration regions within Germany, have got their own data protection regulations that cover local public bodies, and they have local regulations similar to the Federal Data Protection Act. Interestingly, in July 2009, the German legislature passed a number of amendments to this act to strengthen its powers. And most notably, there was a requirement introduced to provide notification of data breaches in a similar way to the United States, and these were effective from the 1st of September 2009. So there we have an example of a country such as Germany implementing additional national requirements above and beyond those that are required by the EU. PCI DSS is probably one of those regulations that appears to have achieved a good compliance versus effort balance. As organisations, certainly that I work with, are generally satisfied that they can achieve their required level of PCI DSS compliance without it breaking their business. If you do look at the 12 requirements of PCI DSS, I guess really no one could argue against the sanity of putting in place these measures. We've got the need to build and maintain a secure network, including installing and maintaining a firewall configured to protect cardholder data and not using default passwords. Well, that's good common sense. Protection of cardholder data and encryption of transmission of the data across open networks. Again, that's good common sense. Maintain a vulnerability management program and use regularly updated antivirus software, and develop and maintain secure systems and applications. Again, well, why wouldn't you? Implementation of strong access control measures and restrict access to cardholder data on a need-to-know basis. So why give everyone access to the cardholder data? They don't need it to do their jobs, and of course that means assigning IDs to people, managing computer access accounts, and also restricting physical access to cardholder data. So starting to see the need for a converged approach as we bring physical and IT security together. We've got the need to regularly monitor and test networks and track and monitor this, which is obviously important to what we're talking about today. So the ability to monitor what's happening across the network, why people are monitoring cardholder data, when are they accessing cardholder data. And finally, have in place a policy that addresses information security. So in practice, I don't see how any information security professional could really argue against implementing these requirements, as they all really go to make up a common sense set of security structures. And having recently had my own credit card details stolen, I'm as keen as anyone to see merchants achieve a better level of security and compliance. Contrast this with the certainly contrast the relative clarity of PCI DSS with the Sarbanes-Oxley requirement in the US, which has got this kind of rather mystical requirement to provide information security, and the notion of providing internal controls and managing and reporting on effectiveness, ensuring integrity, valuability of records. Really, what we have there is a charter for auditors to make a lot of money, and I personally prefer the relative clarity of certainly PCI DSS. So we've seen that compliance is a huge requirement for many businesses, and I think, you know, as we see, we probably agree that the depth and breadth of compliance requirements is only going to deepen. Certainly, as organisations switch onto the world of compliance, they realise that it's far more cost-effective to run compliance systems 24/7 rather than the dreadful, hasty scramble to clean up systems prior to an audit. And I would suggest that these days that process should have long gone, and organisations should be audit ready at all times, or at least strive to be. certainly any investments in systems that assist in gathering data and then produce compliance documentation will inevitably be proven to be a wise one. Certainly, if even in the short term there is some practical and fiscal pain in purchasing and implementing the system, longer term you will certainly get some benefit from it. And I guess this is where knowing the unknowns can pay dividends. I worked with a very large organisation recently that was feeling under a lot of pressure to come up to scratch from a compliance viewpoint. The IT infrastructure was, and indeed still is, huge, and quite frankly systems and servers, networks and deployments ran away with themselves for a number of years. And the IT management was feeling overwhelmed. They needed to try and get a grip. So they put in place some automatic discovery tools to try and scan the network and see what on earth was going on and whether it matched their official documentation. And the scale of the additional network segments, the hidden wireless access points, the secret departmental databases, and the wealth of other unauthorized IT was really frightening. And this shook up the management and led them to a far more structured planning and network management process, and they were quite cute in getting a lot of these issues addressed prior to an audit. But we really, as information security professionals, need to be adding value to the business, and instead of being seen as the people that say no all the time, we should be a conduit to really ease the implementation of these compliance systems. And I think by understanding not only the technical challenges of compliance requirements, but also the business context, we can be seen to add value from the off. Very much the good news is that we've seen investing in compliance can also help deliver a secure working environment. And I think it's beholden on us to ensure that the business really understands the difference between compliance and security, but at the same time sees the improved business case of delivering appropriate security projects on the back of a compliance requirement. Information technology, well, it can be notoriously complex, and we do see business managers being chased away from involvement in decisions relating to technology because we think they just don't understand it. I guess whilst this might be appropriate in very narrow technical decisions, it's important that the business understands IT and how it's benefiting what they do in the business as a whole. From a compliance perspective, it's very easy for the business to be frightened by talk of liabilities, and whilst us technicians appear to spend budgets with limited care for the overall business benefit, the business has got other issues to worry about. And when considering IT compliance, it's really important that we take a strategic approach and we base the decisions on clear, rational thinking. And certainly in my experience, many businesses have rushed into a technical solution that was sold as solving all your compliance issues, only for them to quickly realize the limitations of the product. So IT security professionals have got a responsibility around this, and that's not to only define an effective technical solution, but to make sure that the solution is developed and deployed to mitigate fully the exposure and the risk facing the business. The business, on the other hand, must recognize that IT security is not only an important aspect of the business, but a permanent feature. We're going to be here forever, and the importance of this will only grow as the rights of individuals and their data become more politicized and enshrined in EU and national law. Data itself, as we know, is either static or on the move, and in both cases a business must be able to secure it and to demonstrate to all the parties that it's doing so. And as I think we'd all accept, nothing in our industry stays still for too long. And I think really on that point, I'd like to say a word of caution and an interesting debate around cloud-based computer solutions and compliance. And certainly I've seen a race to the cloud by a number of organizations who have then promptly fallen foul of various data protection regulations and issues such as data privacy. Of course, the cloud delivers some interesting business benefits, but these need to be balanced against the associated security and regulatory issues. Joining these dots, as you mentioned earlier, between security and compliance initiatives when talking about cloud computing can be very tricky. But the good news is that but I think that aligning information security and compliance, although yes, it is a big challenge, is probably getting easier now than it was up until a few years ago. And certainly the availability of tools to help in this process should really reduce the compliance headache and help us get some value out of the compliance process. So we've seen new compliance and legislative requirements continue to emerge, and these are often in response to political initiatives or to market dynamics and the need to manage new technologies. Although I think arguably many of these are not directly aimed at IT systems, it's inevitable that such systems will be used to transport, store and manage data that will be held and then subject to audit control. And therefore there is a need for data to be held and moved demonstrably in a safe and secure way, so that we can prove that integrity is retained. And a good example of this is in the UK, the smart metering initiative, where household energy meters will be upgraded to devices connected to a network, and the data transferred automatically to central billing facilities. Requests for data privacy comments have been made by Ofgem, the energy regulator. And interestingly, although a lot of existing regulations and laws such as the Data Protection Act will be applicable, it won't be surprising if tailored requirements emerge on the basis of this requirement. Effective governance that protects all constituents and demonstrates compliance and clear corporate responsibility will become an increasingly key component of data-related business solutions. And increasing awareness of the consequences of non-compliance will drive requirements for transparency and complete end-to-end visibility of data as it moves within the enterprise and up and down through the supply chain. I'll leave you with one last thought, and that's that here in the UK, after the Second World War, lots of people were driving cars that were in a pretty bad state of repair. The brakes were poor, the lights were damaged, the steering was often ropey. And this led to lots of accidents and injuries that could have been prevented. So in 1960, the Ministry of Transport introduced a compulsory test for motor vehicles that's now commonly called the MOT after the Ministry of Transport. And this was required on all vehicles over 10 years old in an effort to ban the dangerous cars from the road. Over time, the age of the annual test reduced to its current of 3 years, and the breadth and depth of the MOT is now expanded to incorporate new technologies such as catalytic converters. Quite an interesting parallel here is that the growth of IT-related regulations and compliance requirements. Maybe they're following a similar trajectory to the evolution of this MOT test. All in all, we now see far fewer old bangers or clunkers on the road than at any time in the past, and I really wonder whether we will benefit in seeing fewer data breaches and security lapses as computer systems are put through regular audits or MOTs. Of course, the mistake many people make when buying a car is to assume that a current MOT certificate is proof that a vehicle is roadworthy. But of course it isn't, and all that means is at the time of testing, the car was able to pass the MOT test. And I think in a similar way, a computer system may pass an audit, but very rapidly collapse into a state of non-compliance due to mismanagement. And certainly constant attention to audit and compliance is the only sensible way to manage these needs. So who knows, with the development of decent compliance and regulations, we might see less dangerous IT systems and fewer data loss accidents and mishaps. I suppose we can all but hope. So that's it from me. I hope you found this an interesting journey through the world of regulations and compliance. And I'd now like to hand you back to Andy Morris. Andy.
Thank you, Nigel. Could you just advance the slide one more time for me? Thank you very much. So I think congratulations all around for Nigel. Firstly, because the content was very informative and very expansive, and secondly, because it's the only webinar I've ever been on that had the phrase gobsmacked in it. So double level congratulations. To the audience, I thank you very much for listening. I will remind you that if you visit loglogic.com, you can read some of Nigel and some of Nigel's colleagues' work. We currently have the Bloor bullseye that I referenced in the opening of this up there, but we've also got a white paper that talks about how you can start on the road to compliance that Nigel has so eloquently described using log management techniques. So we have an independent paper up there. So thank you very much for all listening in. If you have any questions after the event, obviously you can contact either Nigel or myself, but the address is there on the screen. I hope the rest of your day is successful. Thank you.